Thank you. Look forward to seeing that. Senator Rubio?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, in your statement, I think that the most troubling thing is the following quote from you. Even the most pessimistic assessment did not predict the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. I'd back that up by saying you also cite General Milley, who said there was no indication that there would be a rapid collapse of the Afghan army and government. For much of last year, I was the acting chairman of intelligence. I'm now the vice chairman of intelligence. I've been tracking this very, very closely. And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion. Putting that aside for a moment, we had every reason to believe and to plan for the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and the Afghan government. At the beginning of 2020, by all admissions, we had already really bad status quo in Afghanistan. Okay, we had a small footprint, but we had a strong commitment to air support. And that sustained the Afghan security forces' ability to resist the Taliban. The security forces of Afghanistan were suffering 10,000 casualties a year. The Taliban was suffering casualties too, but they enjoyed safe haven in Pakistan. They were able to go there to rest, to refit, to train, to recruit. And so in summary, even before the withdrawal, we had a terrible status quo. The security forces, a small number of U.S. forces, continued to die. We had U.S. losses as well. I want to mention that. But the Afghan government was still fractious and corrupt. And the Taliban had an unchallenged safe haven in Pakistan. Or put another way, and paraphrasing your own words from your opening statement, if after 20 years...
Senator Marco Rubio emphasized that there were multiple pieces of intelligence, evidence, and even real-time developments that clearly signaled the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and government was not only possible, it was highly likely. Yet, somehow, none of these red flags were taken seriously enough by those in charge. Rubio, having closely monitored Afghanistan during his tenure as acting and now vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee, pointed out that several intelligence documents effectively predicted disaster. He refrained from revealing classified titles but confirmed that the content painted a dire picture. Weeks before Kabul fell, the signs became even more undeniable. The Taliban was no longer limited to isolated operations or small territorial threats. They were gathering in strength, up to 8,000 fighters in some areas, and they began methodically surrounding and isolating strategic locations. Afghan military outposts were surrendering without resistance. Entire provincial capitals were falling one after another, and still, USA leadership maintained public optimism, with President Biden insisting in July that Afghan forces could hold their ground. What's more alarming is that this collapse wasn't based on a sudden change or surprise attack. It was a slow and visible unraveling. The Taliban was isolating Kabul from the north, severing supply lines, and preparing to cut off the city entirely. Fuel shortages were looming, communication routes were being taken, resistance forces were being dismantled, not by overwhelming force, but by strategic pressure and internal weakness. Rubio's analysis underscores that this was not a failure of intelligence gathering. The information was there. Analysts had done their jobs. The breakdown occurred when policymakers failed to act on the information in front of them. Either they were blinded by political goals, like meeting a withdrawal deadline, or they were unwilling to admit that 20 years of effort had not produced a resilient Afghan state. The fact that leaders dismissed the possibility of such a fast collapse, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, reflects a deep problem within the decision-making structure.
If after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training, there's not enough for the Afghan government or the Afghan security forces to become more resilient or self-sustaining, what did we think was going to happen as that support began to be removed? What did we think was going to happen when that terrible status quo was changed? It doesn't take some exquisite piece of intelligence or some brilliant analysis to conclude that if you radically change an already bad status quo, by removing U.S. and NATO forces, by ending enablers and air support, the status quo was going to collapse in favor of the Taliban. This is not an argument in favor of staying. I think that ship has sailed, okay? And I know a lot of time has been spent on justifying the withdrawal. We're not debating the withdrawal. What I'm arguing is we had a terrible status quo as is, by your own admission. The Afghan government, even after billions of dollars in 20 years, was not self-sustaining, was not resilient. We should have known that as we began to draw down support, we were going to see the potential for a collapse. And that's what all these pieces pointed to as well. So it's concerning that no one saw all of this and concluded that there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there could be a rapid collapse. More to that point, we began to see clear signs weeks ago that this is where it was headed. Without airstrikes, the Taliban now began to mass and maneuver, going from intimidating these small Afghan outposts to actually getting them into quitting. We were seeing Afghan outposts begin to quit. They went from surrounding these small provincial capitals to surrounding major cities.
The withdrawal of USA forces from Afghanistan was not just poorly timed, it was deeply flawed in its planning, execution, and motivation. Senator Rubio emphasized that the decision to pull out seemed to be driven more by political symbolism than strategic sense. The insistence on completing the withdrawal by September 11th, a date chosen for its historical significance, so overshadowed the practical realities on the ground. This decision was not anchored in military strategy or real-time intelligence, but in the desire to deliver a narrative of closure, even if it meant ignoring the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. Rubio pointed out that even before the final phase of withdrawal, the Afghan state was fragile. Corruption plagued the government, the military was deeply dependent on USA systems to function, and there were consistent signs of low morale and weak coordination among Afghan troops. Yet, instead of crafting a phased, conditional exit strategy that accounted for these weaknesses, the U.S. leadership executed a rigid timeline-based departure. The mistake wasn't just in leaving, it was in how and when the departure occurred. Policymakers seemed determined to stick to a deadline, regardless of how rapidly the situation changed. Reports on the Taliban's resurgence were pouring in. On the ground, Afghan units were being overrun or surrendering. The Taliban wasn't hiding its moves. They were systematically working their way to Kabul, and yet there was no adjustment in the withdrawal strategy. The refusal to adapt the plan as conditions worsened highlights a rigid, politically motivated mindset that valued headlines over human consequences. Rubio's argument is clear: withdrawing was not the failure. The failure was in designing and executing a strategy that ignored on-the-ground realities and moved forward despite every warning signal flashing red.
With 5,000 to 8,000 Taliban fighters. This is weeks before. By the way, this is at the same time as I believe on July 8th, President Biden was still giving this naive, optimistic prediction about the fighting capabilities of the Afghan forces and so forth. We could see them meticulously focused on the north. You could see that they were methodically and carefully splintering the sclerotic remains of any sort of resistance. Weeks before the fall of Kabul, you could see the Taliban was on the verge, was headed towards doing something they hadn't done before. They were going to isolate Kabul from the north, cutting off all their supply routes. So we knew weeks before that we were headed for a Taliban control of the north. All the traditional routes of Taliban encroachment on Kabul were nearly sealed, the south and the east. Kabul faced the prospect of no fuel. The Afghan government faced the prospect of being unable to mount any viable opposition and sustain defense. What did we think was going to happen? All of those things were in place at the time. And I think the most concerning part of it is that if we didn't have an analysis that looked at all this, this wasn't a failure of intelligence, this was a failure of policy and planning.
Senator Rubio laid out how adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran interpreted the disorder as a clear sign of USA weakness and strategic incompetence. From their perspective, the superpower that had dominated global affairs for decades failed to manage even a planned military exit, creating a perception that the U.S. can no longer be counted on to lead or execute complex operations effectively. This perception is dangerous, as it may embolden these rival nations to test American resolve or take more aggressive steps in regions where USA influence has previously served as a deterrent. The implications of the failed eggs: it also hit USA allies hard. European nations that had troops and stakes in Afghanistan were given little say in the timing or nature of the withdrawal. The abrupt and messy nature of the exit left them scrambling, trying to evacuate their own personnel while dealing with the consequences of America's decision. For them, it raised serious doubts about the reliability of U.S. defense agreements and alliance commitments. India, a key USA partner in the Indo-Pacific and a crucial member of the Quad alliance, is particularly rattled. From India's viewpoint, the U.S. allowed Pakistan, its traditional rival, to play a decisive role in Afghanistan's future. The Taliban's safe havens and support structures in Pakistan were well known, and yet multiple U.S. administrations, as Rubio noted, turned a blind eye. Rubio's warning is clear. This isn't just about one failed mission. It's about what the world sees when it looks at the United States, a partner they can trust or a power in decline. That perception will shape alliances, conflicts, and diplomacy for years to come.
So I think this leaves us in a terrible situation, but I go back to the initial point. I don't know how it's possible. If in fact, the people in charge of our foreign policy did not see all of these factors and conclude that there was a very real possibility of a very rapid collapse, then we've got the wrong people making military and diplomacy decisions in our government.
Senator, I'm happy to respond briefly in the time that we have. As you know from your own expertise and leadership on these matters, there are constant assessments being done, and in this particular case, assessments being done of the resilience of Afghan security forces, of the Afghan government, and different scenarios established, from worst case to best case to everything in between. And ultimately, the preponderance of the intelligence and assessments land someplace, and there are always going to be voices, and critically important that we listen to all of them, who may be talking about exclusively the worst case, some best case, some in between. Here's what I can say in this setting, and we can take this up as well in other settings. Back in February, the assessment of the overall assessment of the community was that after a complete U.S. military withdrawal, that could potentially, in the worst case scenario, lead to the Taliban capturing Kabul within a year or two. So that's back in February, and that was more or less where things stood in the winter and into the spring. By July, and you're exactly right, that the situation was deteriorating as the Taliban continued to make progress on the ground throughout the summer. In July, the IC indicated that it was more likely than not that the Taliban would take over by the end of the year, the end of this year. That said, we, the intelligence community, did not say that the countrywide collapse of all meaningful resistance would be likely to occur in a matter of days. And you referenced Chairman Milley, as I did earlier. Nothing that he saw, that I saw, that we saw suggested that this government and security force would collapse in a matter of 11 days. And you're right that I think we need to look back at all of this because, to your point, we collectively, over 20 years, invested extraordinary amounts in those security forces and in that government. Hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, training, advice, support. And based on that, as well as based on what we were looking at real time, again, we did not see this collapse in a matter of 11 days. But I think it is important that we go back and look